This is CGTN, China Global Television Network.
Hello there, welcome to this edition of Global Business Africa. In the course of the hour, we'll run through the business news stories you need to know about from the continent and beyond. But first, a quick run through the markets. It seems banks are essentially saying, look, we think the worst of the crisis is over, at least if the tone from Equity Bank in its AGM this morning was anything to go by. The board has decided to resume paying dividends in 2022 after a 2-year break. So you can expect anywhere between 30 to 50% of net earnings to be paid out each year. The group CEO, James Mwangi, also doesn't expect any scaled up provisions either. The bank shares have done pretty well so far in the year, up 25% so far in 2021. They've effectively outperformed the largest listed firm on the NSE, Safaricom, over the same period. Here's what's coming up tonight. Nigerian lawmakers are racing to pass long-delayed legislation meant to overhaul the oil sector. Zimbabwe's government has paid the first installment compensation to white farmers. And the UK's travel industry is calling on the British government to open limits on international travel. Plenty to get through in the next 60 minutes, but let's start the hour in the continent's biggest oil and gas producer. Nigerian lawmakers are effectively racing to pass a long-delayed law which aims to overhaul the country's petroleum industry before the current parliamentary session ends in the middle of July. The oil bill was first presented to the National Assembly back in 2008. You remember that. We didn't have a pandemic back then, but we did have a global financial crisis. This law intends to overhaul how energy projects in Nigeria are run and funded. Wrangling between politicians and objections from oil companies have all combined to torpedo previous versions of the petroleum industry bill. Now, a joint committee of the Senate and the House of Representatives is looking at the final draft of the bill at the moment. Committee members aim to submit that bill to their colleagues for adoption before they go on a break on the 16th of July. Lawmakers will be back on duty from that break on the 6th of September. All right, then let's get the latest on this story from Deji Banwas, who joins us now live from Lagos. So, Deji, as we mentioned there, a bit of history. The bill was first introduced in 2008. That's a very long time ago. 13 years later, we're still debating it. What have been the most recent causes of delay in its passage?
Well, the key sticking point now, and which of course might result in this delay you're talking about, is that the host communities are demanding more from the bill. Now, the current bill as we have it, that the lawmakers have, the proposal is to give 2.5% equity to the host communities, but the host communities are actually demanding 10%. And the government says, look, 10% is too much, that the host communities will be given 2.5% of the operating cost of these oil companies now. Now, the reason why these host communities are actually insisting on 10% is because, look, in the past, before now, the previous bill that wasn't passed actually proposed 10%, but it was 10% of the net profit of these oil companies. But then the government and those who are working on the bill reasoned that, look, if you were going to give 10% of the net profit of these oil companies now to the host communities, what happens in a situation where an oil company does not declare profit? So it means nothing would go to the host community. So, and it's the reason why the suggestion has now been made, and it's been put in the bill, that 2.5% should be given to the host community, 2.5% of the operating costs. And according to the government, it's a huge amount of money, but of course, the host communities are not having that. The governors too are not, they're having none of that at all. They're making more demands. They're also asking that they should be given the right of first refusal when it comes to, for instance, floating the shares of the NNPC, that they should be given the right of first refusal. So there are quite a lot of issues, but of course the biggest one has to do with what goes to the host communities. And it's a very sticking point, a lot of argument, and obviously with the way things are now, it's difficult to see how the lawmakers would be able to reach a common ground with these host communities before they go on that recess. And that's why a lot of people are looking at the possibility that this might drag on till September when they come back. But, you know, Ramah,
right.
This is actually one of the reasons why work on this bill has dragged on since 2008.
Okay, so the demands for higher cut of oil revenues from the host communities, because looking at that particular argument, if you look at communities, for example, in the Niger Delta, for the sake of argument, you're dealing with oil spills, and there's been a common constant complaint that, look, we're not getting our fair share, right, of the revenues that are being derived from this resource that's being extracted from our lands, from the lands we occupy. So there is an argument for compensation, but what are the arguments for and against giving these communities the 10% that they're asking for? I mean, why is that so controversial?
Now, it's controversial because, for instance, the oil companies are saying, look, 10% is actually too much to go to these host communities. And apart from that, the government also thinks it's too much because the 10%, as I said, is 10% of the it's a percentage now of the operating cost, because it depends on where you're taking this 10% from. Initially, the plan was to take 10% of the net profit of these oil companies, but then that was changed to 2.5% now of the operating cost of the oil company. And according to the government, they say it's actually 2.5% of the operating cost of these companies would actually amount to something very, very high. But of course, you know, when you talk in percentages and you're not talking in terms of concrete figures now, it's difficult for people to get a clearer idea. 2.5% to me would appear to be small, but then we do not know what the figure would translate to. And so I think it's part of the reasons why these host communities are insisting that, look, for instance, they bear the brunt of oil pollution, environmental degradation and what have you, that they've actually not benefited from the fact that this oil is taken from their land, and so they're demanding more from the oil companies now. It's difficult to see how this is going to be resolved, but I think at the end of the day, if they do not get the 10%, we might see a situation where the 2.5% may have to be moved up. So probably find a common ground, say around, well, maybe 5 or 7%, you never can tell, but we just have to wait and see how this plays out. But
indeed,
it's a very tough one. It's not going to be easy at all for the government to crack this one, because the host communities are actually not shifting ground.
Okay, one last question for you. So we've heard arguments from the oil sector. Firms like Royal Dutch Shell have said that, look, the fact that this law has not been passed is delaying investment in the oil and gas space. But looking back specifically on Royal Dutch Shell, Shell, Total, Eni, just last year, those three companies all agreed to invest in a gas processing facility on Bonny Island, train number 7. So how is non-passage of this bill a barrier to investment? Yet these are the same companies that are putting money into Nigeria's oil sector.
Well, Train 7, actually, the NLNG Train 7 was a decision that was taken a long time ago. But of course, as you've mentioned, the final investment decision was taken late last year. And of course, that train will be coming on stream. I think it's come on stream, actually. So, but all the same, the truth is that, look, whether we like it or not, the oil companies have made it very clear that the non-passage of the PIB has actually affected investment decision. There's no doubt about it. It's affected even the Nigerian government. We've not had enough exploration activities. For instance, you look at, for instance, the oil reserve of the country has stagnated at around 37 billion 37 billion barrels now. So fact is, not much is happening in the industry. And look, Ramah, when you consider the fact that the world is gradually moving away from fossil fuel, and then we are delaying in the passage of this bill, so the window, that investment window you have, is gradually closing. And that's why I think the government is very much in a hurry to get this bill passed. So you talk to the IOCs, they will tell you that one of the reasons why they've actually not made major investment decisions, especially in the petroleum industry, say the upstream, for instance, why so much exploration activities are not taking place at the moment is just because there's uncertainty, and that uncertainty is caused by the non-passage of this bill. So everyone wants to have a clearer idea as to the laws now that would govern the industry. They want to know what share of the profit will be coming to them. They want a review of the production sharing contracts that have been there for a very long time. So a lot of things actually need to change, and the industry is actually waiting for that change to happen. Everyone wants to see that bill passed into law, and then they would then decide how they would make the investment decision. So there's no doubt at all. Look, the country has suffered from the non-passage of this bill. The industry has suffered, and there's been a long push for the passage of this bill. But unfortunately, it appears we're not going to get it by the end of June, as the lawmakers now promised. So probably September. And you never can you just can't bet on it.
Indeed.
You might even not get it by September.
Indeed, it's been
might drag on till the end of the year. You never can tell.
It's been a 13-year wait. Let's see if that turns into 14 years waiting for the petroleum industry bill. Tajibad was there live in Lagos. Now, on to East Africa. The European Union plans to sign an economic partnership agreement with Kenya, leaving out other East African countries that so far have failed to ratify that trade deal. The 27-member trade bloc will first sign the agreement with Kenya as other EAC member states await for ratification. Negotiations on the EPA agreement were wrapped up 7 years ago, but it never went into effect due to lack of approval from other EAC member states. Now, Kenya has already signed the regional EPA and it's ratified it. Kenya and Rwanda, in fact, are the only two countries in the region to sign the EPA back in 2016 after Tanzania, Uganda and Burundi refused to endorse it. And that forced the authorities in Kenya to set up a temporary arrangement with the EU to give its goods duty-free access to its vast market. Up north, Tunisia is one of the latest countries in the world looking to change its rules around cryptocurrencies. Authorities in the North African state say they're closely monitoring developments in the blockchain space and they plan to decriminalize owning and using cryptocurrencies. Now, these proposed legislative changes come after local media reported that some young Tunisian citizens were arrested back in April for using cryptocurrency to settle a transaction online. From Tunis, here's Adnan Chouachi.
The governor of the Central Bank of Tunisia has criticized the arrest of two young men for using cryptocurrency for online transactions.
Tunisian youth are very creative in fintech and startups. They can create an alternative and successful economy. They need and deserve our support. We should not only talk about the vulnerability of our economy, but also about new opportunities.
The country's ICT minister said the government does not plan to restrain cryptocurrency trading and mining and is keen to provide regulatory clarity for crypto adoption.
It is unacceptable to imprison people for using Bitcoin and digital currencies. The technology is developing and our role is to adapt our financial system and guarantee its safety.
Tunisia's foreign exchange legislation dates back to 1976. It bans and criminalizes the use of foreign currencies without a formal authorization from the central bank. However, this law does not apply to cryptocurrencies. Analysts say a clear policy would augur well for the crypto community in Tunisia.
Cryptocurrencies are not stable, but they are an alternative way of making business, creating opportunities and investments for entrepreneurs. Tunisia will keep on using local currencies. Meanwhile, authorizing cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and digital currencies requires the adoption of new law. The old legislation is irrelevant. This will spare investors jail.
Several members of parliament have denounced the government's cryptocurrency mining crackdown. Some MPs say the finance committee is willing to decriminalize buying and mining cryptocurrencies.
It's unacceptable to arrest and jail talented Tunisians for owning Bitcoin and mining crypto. This is a scandal. The parliament will push and lobby for the adoption of a new legislation. We cannot work in 2021 with the tools and laws for the previous century. Let's encourage our youths to be creative and innovative.
Even without regulatory clarity, crypto adoption in Tunisia is growing at a record pace. According to a report from Carthage, an English-language Tunisian publication, Tunisian user registrations on crypto exchanges are up 11% in the first quarter of 2021 compared to last year.
Tunisia's Minister of Economy declared that he wants to change the law around cryptocurrencies
which condemns people for mining cryptos and using them as payment. However, some advisors to the Prime Minister warned that speculation was a threat to the country's financial system. Adnan Shawishi, CGTN, Tunis.
A little further to the east, and the owners and insurers of the giant cargo ship that blocked the Suez Canal in March say they've reached an agreement in principle with the Suez Canal Authority. That initial agreement comes after 3 months of talks. Egypt had earlier on been asking for more than $900 million in compensation for getting the ship out of the canal without any harm to it. Now, the Ever Given's grounding interrupted a critical link in the global supply chain after it stood in the way of some 422 ships that crossed that vital trade waterway every day.
The Ever Given, the ship that blocked the Suez Canal entirely for 6 days 3 months ago, could soon be released from Egyptian custody. Egyptian authorities say they've made an initial agreement with the ship's company over the compensation it will pay the Suez Canal for its successful rescue mission and to compensate for the loss in canal revenues it caused. Egypt has been seizing the ship and most of its crew since March 29. That is when it dislodged the Ever Given after freezing navigation completely in the canal. Negotiations with insurers and the ship's owner failed repeatedly during these 3 months. Initially, Egypt wanted more than $900 million for rescuing the vessel without damaging its body and saving its load of 18,500 containers. After the Japanese owner offered $150 million, the Suez Canal Authority decreased its aspired amount to $550 million. But that too was not acceptable for the cargo ship's negotiating team. Neither the Canal Authority nor the Ever Given representatives have officially announced the final bill. Negotiations to finalize the initial agreement will begin next week. The Ever Given could be finally free to head to its final destination in Europe once its owner makes a down payment to the Suez Canal Authority. Adel Mahroui, CGTN, Cairo.
All right, then a quick run through some news making your headlines tonight. Starting in Mozambique, the country's announced plans to sell a majority stake in the planned $2.4 billion Mpandankua hydropower plant. It's said to be one of the largest in Southern Africa. The goal is to reach a financial close by 2024 on this 1.5 gigawatt facility and an associated transmission line which could increase the total project cost to as much as $4.4 billion. In East Africa, Kenyan lawmakers have cut proposed duty on nicotine pouches by 76%, offering a bit of a boost to British American tobacco. The move is part of a plan to earn Kenya at least $13.9 million a year in exports of that particular commodity. The Parliamentary Finance and National Planning Committee has also proposed to cut the $46 per kilo of oral nicotine pouches consumed by placing them between the upper lip and the gum, fronted by Treasury, down to at least $11. Antivirus software pioneer John McAfee was found dead in a jail cell in Spain on Wednesday from an apparent suicide. His death came shortly after the court in Spain approved his extradition to the United States, where he was wanted for tax evasion. McAfee had been in jail in Spain ever since he was arrested at a Barcelona airport in October 2020, just as he was about to board a flight to Istanbul, Turkey. If convicted, he would have faced up to 30 years behind bars. And finally, IBM is developing tools to ensure that online ad algorithms do not unfairly show ads to only specific groups of people, like, say, mostly men or mostly wealthy people. Effectively, they're aiming to address discrimination concerns that have drawn industry-wide scrutiny around algorithms. IBM will spend 6 months exploring ways to spot and mitigate unintended bias. Academic researchers and civil rights groups have found that for decades, some audiences, including black people and women, can be excluded from some jobs, housing and other ads because of potentially unlawful choices made by advertisers or automated systems that they use. That's the run through your company headlines. You're watching Global Business Africa. Time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. Zimbabwe pays the first installment of compensation to white farmers. And inflation in South Africa hits a 30-month high as food prices rise. The details coming up next.
The world economy as we know it is about to change. Global business reports highlight emerging markets, developing countries, and dynamic sectors worldwide. We feature top analysts and newsmakers to provide perspectives on every facet of business. From an on-the-ground perspective, we provide you with balanced and objective assessments. Fast, sharp, and insightful. Global Business. Only on CGTN.
Every story starts out like this.
Okay. We'll head up now.
But beyond the rush of the numbers, there's always a more fundamental question. What happened? Who has been affected? When market-moving decisions are made, who's responsible and why?
Let's get some reaction on ground. Joining us in Johannesburg is Sumitra Nairobi. Hello, Nairobi.
This is how whole stories begin. See how they end. Only on Global Business.
Welcome back to the program. Let's head over to Zimbabwe. The government there has made its first compensation payment to white farmers whose lands were seized by the government nearly 20 years ago. The state-linked Kuvimba mining house transferred $1 million to the farmers as the government asked for a delay in paying out the full compensation. President Emmerson Mnangagwa's administration tabled a $3.5 billion offer to former commercial white farmers last year. Well, that amount, roughly $1.75 billion, was supposed to have been paid next month, and the balance would be paid in installments of $437 million a year over 4 years. But that has not happened. At least 4,000 white farmers were forcibly evicted from farms during the land redistribution program in the early 2000s. Now, consumer inflation in South Africa has gone up to a 30-month high in the month of May. According to Statistics South Africa, headline inflation went up to 5.2% year-on-year in May compared to 4.4% the month before. Now, that was the highest inflation reading since November 2018, driven up by transport, food and non-alcoholic beverages. From Johannesburg, here's Sumitra Naidu.
It's the highest reading since November 2018, but it didn't come as a complete surprise. Some economists say the annual inflation rate came in line with expectations. That's because it's coming off a low base. Oil prices crashed this time last year as governments around the world imposed lockdowns, forcing businesses to close and restricting the movement of people. Everything measured in the basket of goods rose in May. Food and transport costs were the main drivers.
Food, we've had a couple of outliers as well, the tomato shortages and some of the fruit and veggie shortages and all the rain and everything else. I think one more thing that we just have to take into consideration is that the very low base from which we are coming.
While South Africans struggle to get back into work mode as the economy reopens, they also have to deal with the rising cost of living. Transport was the biggest driver in these latest inflation figures, and that's because petrol prices have gone up almost 42% since last year.
Food and non-alcoholic beverages came in 6.7% higher, while the cost of transport rose 15.3% year-on-year in May. Fuel costs went up 37% from 21% in April. Even the price of cooking oil rose significantly, up 8.5% since April, but 30% up since last year.
Everything is up, even like the taxes now. It's difficult to get to work or to wherever you're going because the transport has gone up, the petrol has gone up, so it's difficult to make the ends meet.
Pretty much everything has gone up these days, transport-wise, food cost and everything.
These days you can't do groceries with less than 2,000 rands, for an example, and you still have to pay other bills like rent, water. Electricity is expensive. It doesn't last long like in the olden days.
It's unlikely to get any easier as this number could push the Reserve Bank to hike rates. At 5.2%, the inflation rate has now gone beyond the midpoint of the bank's target band of 3 to 6%.
Need higher interest rates in South Africa to attract scarce capital, not just in the short term to support the currency, but also in the longer term to support the economic growth. I'm just hoping they might give us 2 or 3 more months of breathing room, especially for the consumer that we know is still under a lot of pressure.
The Reserve Bank cut rates by 300 basis points last year and said it would keep the rate low as long as inflation remained at a moderate level. With consumer inflation now over 5%, it's unlikely that the bank can delay a rate hike any longer. Sumitra Naidu, CGTN, Johannesburg, South Africa.
On to South Sudan. The country has officially rolled out its first oil licensing auction. 5 blocks are on offer. The Petroleum Ministry says that this oil licensing round is looking to attract interest from a diverse group of foreign investors. The available blocks range in size, between 4,000 to 25,000 square kilometers. South Sudan gets almost all of its government revenue from oil sales. It's been trying to boost output in a bid to reach pre-war production levels of at least 350,000 barrels of crude every day. On to Egypt. Authorities say that since mid-2018, the country has introduced more than 3.5 million housing units to switch over to natural gas. The North African state has allocated more than $700 million to a range of economic activities, including supplying homes with natural gas and also trying to encourage people to switch their vehicles to run on gas instead of diesel or gasoline. Here's Yasser Kim with more from Cairo.
Egypt's government has been working hard to replace butane gas cylinders with natural gas around the country. The North African state's latest gas discoveries in the Red Sea and East Mediterranean have allowed it to be self-sufficient, making natural gas a better option than fuel or butane.
The more we put natural gas in houses, the more we save in petroleum products and butane imports. This reduces state expenditure, reduces subsidies on energy, improves the state budget and cuts deficit. For citizens, using natural gas is cheaper than butane gas cylinders and cheaper than electricity. And finally, you are cutting on pollution because natural gas is cleaner than fuel, butane and oil.
According to Egypt's petroleum minister, 3.5 million units have benefited from the service since 2018, making a total of 11.5 million units operating on natural gas. To encourage Egyptians to transfer to natural gas, the government has subsidized the cost of setting up the gas pipelines at home, and payments are allowed for over 6 years. It's also offering discounts on monthly bills for commercial and industrial units.
The government is targeting to speed up the process and introduce natural gas to 1.2 million units per year so that most houses would have natural gas in about 3 years' time.
But there are logistical challenges, including reaching out to ill-equipped cities. The government has introduced mobile natural gas trucks that pump gas not just for cars, but for houses and factories in remote areas. The project is part of the government's drive for renewable energy to account for 42% of total energy sources by 2030. Yes, Hakim for CGTN, Cairo.
Now, the high rate of borrowing, especially fresh debt in Nigeria, was part of the agenda during the ongoing African Development Bank Group's annual meetings. The Director General of the World Trade Organization, Dr. Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, and the AfDB President, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, both expressed concern about the rising amount of debt right across the continent. Authorities in Africa's biggest economy, however, say they don't see any cause for alarm. Here's CGTN's Phil Ihaza with their argument.
Nigeria's high level of borrowing is once again dividing opinion. Both the Nigerian Finance Minister and the WTO boss spoke at an African Development Bank event, which was held virtually on Wednesday. While Finance Minister Zainab Ahmed put the country's debt to gross domestic product or GDP ratio at 29%, WTO head Okonjo-Iweala said it had risen to 35%. Ahmed says Nigeria plans to borrow more money to fund its infrastructure capacity and boost its economy. This is in spite of criticisms on the government to hold borrowing and concentrate on other means of raising funds to tackle the country's infrastructure needs. However, Okonjo-Iweala, who had been Nigeria's Minister of Finance in the past, said the nation's debt-to-GDP ratio had risen from 29% to 35%. She added that scarcity of foreign exchange in some African countries like Nigeria was forcing governments to use the same resources to fund debt repayment rather than capital investment. According to the Debt Management Office, Nigeria's total public debt rose from about $30 billion in June 2015 to over $80 billion as of March. But the country's finance minister says there's no cause for alarm, as the government is enforcing fiscal discipline enough to service its debt and borrow more in order to boost the nation's infrastructure capacity. Phil Ihaza, CGTN, Abuja.
Now, the World Bank has approved $292 million in lending for infrastructure projects for Zanzibar. That funding is in addition to $4.9 billion the lenders already approved to push a range of projects. It will enable nearly 400,000 residents of Zanzibar to get access to reliable and affordable grid electricity and also improve water infrastructure and transport on the island. The Tanzanian government has been using its own internal resources to fund key development projects following a decision by foreign donors to withhold funds. Donors had withheld funding in the wake of allegations of human rights violations and repressive government policies during the reign of the late president, John Pombe Magufuli. Still in East Africa, the International Monetary Fund has approved the disbursement of over $400 million for Kenya as the latest tranche of the country's $2.34 billion loan. That approval comes after the fund wrapped up its first review of the 38-month program. Kenya's total disbursements in that program are now around $715 million. Kenya plans to narrow its fiscal deficit for the year starting in July to 7.5% of GDP from an estimate of 8.6% of GDP in the fiscal year that ends next week. Now, the forecast also assumes, critically, that the government will achieve an economic growth rate of roughly 6.6% this year and increase tax revenue, despite all the job losses we saw in 2020. East Africa's largest economy grew by just about 0.6% in 2020 as a pandemic choked off investment, shut down businesses, increased non-performing loans and cut jobs as well. According to the IMF, it's expecting GDP growth of 6.3% this year in Kenya. Operations started in 2017 in Kenya's Mombasa to Nairobi Railway. The standard gauge rail line, or the SGR as it's more commonly referred to here, is a key infrastructure project in the country. It's part of the country's broader modernization drive. Built and financed by China, a key pillar of the project has been the transfer of skills and knowledge. CGTN's Robert Nagila caught up with one of the beneficiaries of this program. This is that story.
28-year-old Emmanuel Otieno is a train conductor on Kenya's standard gauge rail line operating between the capital Nairobi and the coastal city Mombasa. Otieno is responsible for a team of 13 staff on board the train.
I usually receive the train in the morning at 7. I have to check all my facilities in the coach. I check the emergency harness. I take the fire extinguishers, the train number cards, and also my team. I have to ensure that everything is in place for them. I assign them their duties.
As the train departs the station, Otieno is now responsible for over 1,000 passengers.
Our passengers are our first priority. That is the one thing that we learned from our training. So we have to ensure that our passengers are comfortable. In case there's any issue inside the train, then it's my duty to ensure that it is well resolved.
He interacts with passengers, answering their questions and ensuring their comfort.
The maximum speed is 120 kilometers. Yeah, for the cargo is 80 kilometers.
Emmanuel's worked as a train conductor for the past 4 years. Taught at the Railway Training Institute in Nairobi by Chinese instructors, he says he's carried on parts of his training to his daily life.
That is something that I've also adopted in my social life. So yeah, time management, that is the best thing I can say I learned from the Chinese.
A first-class ticket costs $30, while a second-class seat is $10. For passengers, the SGR has transformed how they travel. It's safe, fast and efficient.
The reception is very, very positive from the passengers. They enjoy the service on board. They find it very, very satisfactory.
At the next train stop, a passenger is running late, but makes it just in time.
I just bought.
The train must run on schedule.
The cooperation between Kenya and Chinese, it has really been of a good impact, especially to us as the youths. We have gained a lot of technical experience with them during those 4 years.
For many travelers, the SGR is more than just transport. It's an experience.
We see a lot of animals there, the zebras, we see gazelles, the elephants. So we also see good animals there, the monkeys, even I can see some right now.
500 kilometers later, the journey is over. 6 hours after we left Nairobi, we're now in the coastal city of Mombasa. And this is not even the express train. Hard to believe, not too long ago, the same journey took between 12 and 15 hours. Robert McGill, CGTN, Mombasa, Kenya.
At 18:35 GMT, time for a short break. Here's what's coming up next. The UK travel industry is calling on the British government to open limits on international travel. And the European Commission approves France's $41 billion economic recovery plan. The details coming up shortly.
No one again, he can hold in guns. Machine guns from police forces towards the protesters.
Were you worried about your life at that particular time?
Not at all.
Thank you very much for your time. What is your assessment of the state of the continent today?
Africa has the potential to power itself.
Excuse me.
How will your world change today? What happens here? What happens there? Or what you make happen for yourself? If it matters to you, it matters to us too. Your stories are these stories that need to be told. Africa Live. Find your voice.
Welcome back to the program. Let's run through some of the stories making your headlines at this hour, starting in Burkina Faso. The government and the UN said that a massacre in which 130 people were killed earlier this month was carried out mostly by child soldiers. According to government spokesman Useni Tambura, the child soldiers involved in that attack were between the ages of 12 and 14. On the evening of the 4th of June, the armed assailants are reported to have raided the village of Solhan, where they set homes on fire and shot residents. In a statement, UNICEF reiterated its condemnation of the recruitment of children as fighters. The Southern African Development Community, or SADC as it's more commonly known, has agreed to deploy forces to help end an insurgency in Mozambique's Cabo Delgado. The agreement was made at a one-day summit held in Maputo on Wednesday, while key discussions at the meeting included regional integration, cooperation and development. Right at the top of the agenda was a fight against terrorism in Mozambique. Over the last 3 years, militants have intensified their attacks, have seized control of towns and villages, hundreds of people. At least 10 Kenyan soldiers have been killed in a helicopter crash in Kajiado County on the outskirts of the capital, Nairobi. The Kenya Air Force aircraft was carrying 23 soldiers that were out for a training exercise when it plummeted to the ground on Thursday morning. Soldiers were wounded in the accident were airlifted to a military hospital in the capital for further treatment. The cause of that accident is yet to be determined. And finally, Algerian media is reporting that the Prime Minister, Abdelaziz Jarrad, has stepped down. This follows legislative elections which were held earlier this month. It also opens the door for the president to name a new cabinet. The country's incumbent ruling party, the National Liberation Front, won the most seats in the vote held on the 12th of June. Polls, however, saw relatively low turnout and there was no majority winner. That's a run through your headlines. The United Kingdom's travel industry is calling on the UK's government to open limits on international travel. The industry sounding the alarm in a bid to protect nearly 200,000 jobs related to the tourism sector. Here's Nicole Johnston in London with the latest.
From airlines to travel operators, tour companies, ferries and airports, the UK tourist industry is here for a day of action. They're protesting against the British government's restrictions on international travel. People have joined in across the country, rallying at airports and outside Parliament. They're ramping up pressure on the government to make it easier for people to travel abroad for international holidays without quarantining when they come home.
Our message to the government as a travel agent is just please listen to our specific circumstances. We don't earn any money until people travel, and the lack of people travelling, we've not earned any money in 16 months.
The government has a traffic light system for travel, classifying countries as green, amber or red according to their COVID-19 risk. But right now, very few countries are green, and most of them won't accept British tourists anyway, except for Iceland.
The government tried to reintroduce the traffic light system 3-4 weeks ago with promises that they wouldn't make the same mistakes that they did the first time round, and unfortunately within 3 weeks, we had the situation where they'd moved it from green to amber with no notice for customers, and therefore you get this scramble of people trying to get back to the UK to beat the self-isolation deadline. That costs them money, it's a lot of stress for people. I think it's unfair on families.
Local operators and tour guides say the domestic travel industry is also because no one wants to travel here while the UK has such strict quarantine rules.
We've been absolutely flattened. Tourists are just not coming. I've had no work since the 28th of February last year.
The travel industry is calling on the government to expand its travel green list and to extend furlough until April next year. It says that 200,000 jobs are at risk and hundreds of thousands of airline jobs as well. Nicole Johnston, CGTN, London.
Let's dig a little deep into that story. Elena Cassas joins us now live from London with the latest on this. So, Elena, the government did announce its revised travel list today. Bring us up to speed with the latest policy changes.
Well, we heard from Grant Shapps, the Transport Minister, in the last few minutes. He added a few countries to Britain's very short green list, including Malta, Madeira, Spain's Balearic Islands and a handful of Caribbean countries. He also added a dozen to the red list, which forces returning travellers to quarantine in a hotel for 2 weeks, including Tunisia. Now, of course, some of this may turn out to be moot anyway, because the German Chancellor Angela Merkel is leading a push at today's EU summit for all European countries to quarantine arriving travellers from Britain for 2 weeks because of the Delta variant, which originated in India, which means that coronavirus cases are now higher in Britain than anywhere else in Europe, although that's not being reflected at the moment in hospitalisations and deaths. But it certainly does make British tourists a bit more unwanted on the European continent. And as you can see, the British government is being very conservative with its green list of countries where people are allowed to travel. The Transport Minister also said that British residents returning from amber list countries, that's the vast majority of the world, would be able to avoid that 2-week quarantine if they're fully vaccinated from some point in the summer. But he didn't say when or exactly how that would work.
Indeed. So the industry body's been arguing that the government needs to remove these testing and quarantine requirements for fully vaccinated people who are coming in from countries classified as green or amber. But what is the government's rationale for keeping those requirements in place? Because up and down that entire list, you've got requirements for at least 2 PCR tests and some element of quarantine, despite people being able to prove that, hey, we either are COVID negative or we've been vaccinated.
Yes, it's worth pointing out that those 2 COVID tests are also very expensive here in Britain, costing about $300 for every traveller. Now, the British government is under a lot of pressure to start liberalising those travel rules. As you heard in that story, the travel industry says about 200,000 jobs here in Britain either have already been lost or they will be if the government doesn't change tack quite soon. But it's also been under fire for allowing too much travel in the past and allowing in dangerous variants of of the coronavirus. The Delta variant, of course, originated in India and now accounts for the vast majority of cases here in Britain. The British government didn't put India on its travel red list, essentially blocking flights until some time after that variant had been originally detected, and they have come under intense criticism. The government is now very concerned not to let further variants in. They say they base how countries are listed not only on the coronavirus case rate there, but also on the vaccination rate and the presence of other variants of concern. But what they haven't actually done is release any data to the press, like cases per 100,000, that can help us understand why exactly certain countries are on one list rather than another.
Indeed, and that leads me to my next question, because the government just keeps being criticised for the seemingly haphazard way in which countries go on and off this traffic light system. You cited the case of India. There was a huge row around that back in April, because in some instances, some countries have a lower new case count per 100,000 people than the UK. But why is the system so seemingly haphazard?
Well, yes, the government has come under a lot of criticism for this. You might remember that last summer, lots of British holidaymakers did go on holiday and then were told that they had to quarantine while they were away, causing panics in airports as people tried to rush home. The government did promise to avoid that happening again this year, but they have instead gone for this very conservative policy, which aims to dissuade people from travelling as much as possible. And that is causing frustration here in Britain, particularly among people who are fully vaccinated, which is now more than 60% of all adults here, and more than 80% of people have had at least one shot. So people are questioning the government's rationale here. But as I say, they say that they want to move forward as cautiously as possible, that they're concerned about importing new variants, and that they will next month announce a policy allowing British residents to travel to most countries, those who are on the amber list, once they've been fully vaccinated. We just don't have the details of that policy yet.
Indeed, we'll be waiting for the data, as I'm sure pretty much everyone else will. Elena Casas in London, thank you. Now, the European Commission has approved France's $41 billion plan to recover from the pandemic and transform the economy to become greener and a lot more digitalised in the years to come. The scheme will be financed from EU grants until 2026. Once a plan is also approved by EU finance ministers in July, France will get some $6 billion in pre-financing for projects foreseen under the plan. More cash will be paid out on completion of agreed-to stages of these reforms and investments spelled out in the plan. The Commission said France planned to spend at least 46% of the cash to reach climate neutrality goals, including investments in energy renovation of buildings, clean mobility infrastructure and vehicles, and the decarbonisation of a range of industrial processes.
To sum it up, the French plan will help France maintain its autonomy and its leadership by investing in innovation and technologies of the future, all while keeping at heart the need to maintain cohesion, inclusion and social justice.
Today, our priority is to continue to get out of the pandemic, and I want here to really defend the work that we have led among Europeans and the work that you and your most committed commissioners have done over vaccinations in Europe. Europe is in the process of succeeding with regard to vaccinations, and it is continuing at an onward march with a joint purchasing policy, but also now with policies of research and innovation that we have decided on for the future.
The billionaire investor Warren Buffett is resigning as a trustee of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. The announcement comes from Buffett. It comes weeks after Bill and Melinda Gates revealed that they were divorcing after 27 years of marriage. But they will continue, they say, to jointly run one of the largest charitable foundations in the world. Buffett is also the chairman and CEO of Berkshire Hathaway. He also announced a new $4.1 billion donation of Berkshire shares to the charity. That takes him about halfway to meeting a 2006 pledge to give all of his shares in the conglomerate to 5 organizations, including the Gates Foundation. Since 2006, he's donated more than $41.5 billion worth of Berkshire shares. Shanghai's gaming industry posted robust revenue growth last year, over $18 billion in revenue coming in through the door. Mobile games dominated a big chunk of that, and they're starting to be big players on the international scene, as CGTN's Lei Shuran now finds out.
International sales by Shanghai's game industry rocketed by more than half last year. Research firm CNG says the city's game producers reported overseas revenues of nearly 21 billion yuan in 2020. Buffett Technology is one of the companies contributing to that and is now selling more than 20 games overseas after making some changes for the foreign markets.
18年以来就在立志于在做这个游戏出海方面的。
We have been selling games overseas since 2018. Before that, most of our sales were from the domestic market, but now 60% of our customers are overseas players. Our daily active users outside China are now over 20 million. We've made some changes in our games, bringing them more in line with some traditional festivals in countries other than China.
地区有一些特殊节日，可能跟国内不一样，包括北美也是。
Xiao says the fact that people have had more time to play games due to the COVID-19 pandemic has contributed to revenue growth as well. Her company and other Shanghai developers like MiHoYo and Lilith Technology jumped at the increased demand to launch new games last year. Now they're leveraging the growth in live streaming and the short video industry to improve both domestic and international sales. Lin Keqing is contributing some of their revenue.
我最近就是玩一些，确实看到一些国产。
There are more Chinese mobile games and console games that have launched recently, and I've seen more live streamers playing Chinese games. Many of the games are quite relaxing and funny, and that attracted me a lot.
就看起来挺好玩的。
Improved animation and other special effects have also helped the Shanghai developers gain popularity overseas.
其实上游戏现在的制作都是一个更为复合。
Developing a game also needs professionals in areas like music and art, which the good universities in the city offer. And we have supportive policies on tax and investment here, which bring in more skilled producers and game studios. That results in more well-made games being developed in Shanghai. At least one Shanghai game makes a hit overseas every year.
这个爆品游戏在海外成功发行。
The recent success of Shanghai's gaming industry has some big investors like Sony taking a look at investment possibilities in the city's game companies.
招募独立制作者或者说招募游戏。
Many foreign game companies are now partnering with domestic developers, especially in Shanghai, to co-develop and run corporations. They are also investing in some small development teams. The foreign investors are attracted by our growing producing power and are increasingly willing to put money into China's gaming industry.
一起共同发展这么一个过程。
Wang says Shanghai's popularity as a convention city is also helping the growth of the city's gaming industry. Next month, the city will host the China International Cartoon and Game Expo and the China Joy Gaming event as well. Lei Shuran, ICS for CGTN, Shanghai.
A bit of art on What's Hot tonight will take you to Amsterdam. For the first time in 3 centuries, Rembrandt's famed The Night Watch is back on display. Researchers say in its original size, the missing edges of the painting apparently have been temporarily restored with the help of some clever algorithms.
Rembrandt finished the large canvas, which portrays the captain of an Amsterdam city militia ordering his men into action in 1642. It is now considered one of the greatest masterpieces of the Dutch Golden Age. But strips were cut from all 4 sides of it during a move in 1715.
We knew this, that they were cut off, because we have a copy from the 17th century that still shows the entire composition. It's a small copy though, and on the basis of this copy and a very detailed photograph that we took of the Night Watch, we, through artificial intelligence, taught a computer to reconstruct these missing pieces.
The museum's senior scientist explained some of the steps in crafting the missing parts, which are hung to overlap the original work without touching it.
The computer even learns to hallucinate cracks because that's part of the Night Watch. So we don't really care about this, the middle part, because we already have the Night Watch, and that's definitely better than what the computer can imagine. But now we can use these parts on the left, right, top, and bottom, where we don't know what the answer is, and then combine the two. So this is the final result.
The artificial intelligence software learned by trying millions of times to approximate Rembrandt's style and colors more closely for humans to assess. CGTN.
All right, then a quick update on commodity prices as we consistently watch the upward march of oil prices here. Brent crude over $75 again at several points in trading today. The OPEC Plus production group is going to be meeting it again next week, given as prices on both Brent and WTI cross over $75 and $71 a barrel. Brent crude, in fact, has been hovering in between 73 and 75, 79 most of this week. At those levels, its year-to-date gain is around 46%. WTI has gone up by 50% over the same period. It's gone as high as 73.83 so far this week. Now, for more than 2,500 years, Tripoli's old city has been the beating heart of that city. Founded by Phoenician traders in the 7th century, it contains a wealth of historic treasures, all of which is to serve as some pretty interesting tourist attractions. But with Libya battleground between rival governments and Tripoli under control of the Islamist-backed Fajr Libya militia, today visitors are virtually nowhere to be seen. CGTN's Alexander Majala has more on how copperworks have been hit.
Libyan copper production is under the threat of extinction. High rental fees and the disruption of the tourism industry are two contributing factors. When coupled with hefty prices of raw materials, craftsmen in Tripoli's copper market are increasingly becoming reluctant to continue with their trade.
The Tourism Ministry and General Committee of Awqaf own a lot of stores in markets. They should be considerate of craftsmen in terms of high rent. The Tourism Ministry should do the same. If tourism remains low in future years, the market will completely disappear due to the reluctance of craftsmen who will change their profession and products instead of old professions.
While usually hustling and bustling with tourists and customers requesting traditional Libyan crafts, products of artistic significance are currently showcased in empty stores. With Libya plagued by chaos and violence since the end of the 2011 revolt that toppled Muammar Gaddafi and rival governments wrestling for control of Tripoli, today visitors are scarce, and craftsmen have little hope of finding buyers for their copperwork.
We have foreign products, but people want Libyan products. Some customers come and ask for a Libyan tray or a Libyan container. The tray behind me is unfortunately currently unavailable. We would love to find it in other places. Utensils, trays, and lanterns. They get lanterns from Egypt, although we have traditional Libyan models.
Even though the old city was not a major battleground during the revolution, nor in the recent violence that has swept Libya, work to maintain it has all but halted since 2011, and several years of neglect are starting to show. Along its narrow cobbled streets, the old city's paint is peeling and its masonry is crumbling. Many historic sites have been vandalized, including some mosques and grave sites. Alexandria Majala for CGTN.
All right then, a quick run through the currencies for you. We'll focus on East Africa at this particular point in time. The first corporate bond issuance in several years, one from Family Bank, actually got a fairly decent performance. It got approval from the Capital Markets Authority today to essentially exercise a green shoe option, raise another 1 billion shillings, roughly $100 million or so from the markets. But does that signal a revival in the corporate debt market? That does deserve some further inquiry. On the T-bill side of things, the weekly auctions happened today in Kenya. The target was to raise about $220 million, but they only managed to raise roughly 16 billion shillings. It's about 160 or so odd million dollars in today's auction. We'll leave it there for the time being. That's it for this edition of Global Business Africa. As always, we'd like to hear your thoughts on the content you've seen here in the last hour. Several ways to get your feedback back to us, all of them on your screens right now. I'm Ramah Nyang in the Kenyan capital, Nairobi. Thank you for your company in the last hour. The World Today is up next from Washington, D.C.